You know, it was so nice of Square to give that one guy from Super Smash Bros. Brawl his very own game. You know, I respect that. Hey there, all you beautiful guardians of the glaze. Welcome back to the Milky Donut. If you're new here, this is the Milky Donut. We do all things video games, movies, and pop culture. And if you're not new here, does your girlfriend's husband know that you're that good looking? Well, I sure hope not. Well, before we jump back into our video game time travel machine, I would like to mention that I do have a goal of reaching 10,000 subscribers as quickly as I can, and we are so close. So if you enjoy, don't forget to like the video, leave the glaziest of comments, hype it if you can, and subscribe if you think it's worthy of the algorithm. As always, shout out to the current subscriber of the week, Mr. Sheriff Sour Hour, and feel free to run this video up because you could very well be the next MVP. And with all that nonsense out of the way, let's jump back into our video game time travel machine and play one of the most apparently legendary games of all time for the very first time. When I finished Final Fantasy VI, I genuinely couldn't imagine how Square was supposed to top it, because if you've seen that video, you know that game completely shattered every assumption that I had about turn-based RPGs. I won't retread old ground too much, but if you want to see me look like an ignorant little turd nugget while I get every expectation I had completely blown into the stratosphere, go ahead and watch this video right here. One thing I had briefly mentioned in that video as well was despite never actually playing Final Fantasy games growing up, it somehow never felt unfamiliar to me, because like a lot of people my age, I already knew Cloud. I knew Sephiroth and a lot of the other characters, because when I was younger, I was obsessed with one of Square's lines of action figures. I'd buy them from this store called Video Games Etc. and make terrible little stop motion videos with my shitty slider phone camera. And looking back, they were absolutely awful and cringeworthy, but at the same time, I had so much fun doing it that never even mattered. So even though I knew almost nothing about Final Fantasy VII's story, I did feel strangely nostalgic toward it before I ever even picked up the controller. I knew the faces, I knew that big-ass sword, but what I didn't know was why people still talk about this game with almost reverential admiration nearly 30 years later. Well, that answer becomes obvious almost immediately, because Final Fantasy VII feels like a declaration that video games had entered a completely new era. During my research, as I always do, I read that after years of developing on Nintendo cartridges, Square made the jump to the original PlayStation, and they wasted absolutely no time showing everyone what CDs made possible. That opening cinematic still gives your boy chills thinking about it. Quiet shot of Aerith praying, the camera slowly pulling away before revealing the endless steel maze of Midgar, the train racing through the city, and Cloud jumping from the carriage as the bombing mission begins. It's difficult to overstate just how revolutionary this must have felt in 1997. Now, I had already played games like Metal Gear Solid in this series, so obviously these kinds of cinematic presentations weren't completely new to me, but putting myself in the mindset of someone experiencing this back then, it must have felt like watching the future unfold right before your eyes. And Final Fantasy VI had already proven that games could tell emotional stories, part 2 spoiler video for that game coming by the way, you're welcome, but Final Fantasy VII was proving that they could present those stories on an entirely different scale. Now, a lot of you mentioned how badly the graphics held up, but you know what? I can't be the only one who likes the look of this, right? I mean, there's just something so comforting about it, to the point where I actually think I like the look of this more than the remake, which I've also never played, and that might be a hot take, but you know what? I don't care, because I just like how this looks, okay? And what really hooked me wasn't the hardware anyways, it was the atmosphere. Instead of castles, medieval kingdoms, and cozy villages, you're dropped into Midgar, a sprawling industrial metropolis that immediately becomes one of the most memorable cities I've ever explored in a video game. It's lived in, dirty, oppressive, and claustrophobic, with steel pipes stretching across the skyline like something ripped straight out of Blade Runner. Towering reactors dominate every single horizon for as far as the eye can see. The upper city literally casts a shadow over the slums beneath it. Everywhere you look, you can feel the divide between the people with power and those forced to live underneath it. And what makes Midgar so fascinating is that Shinra doesn't simply feel like another evil corporation. They're pretty much the government, and maybe this dystopian world isn't so far from our own. Anywho's, Shinra controls the energy, the military, scientific research, transportation, and the flow of information. They employ thousands of people while simultaneously exploiting the very planet that they're built on. It's essentially a corporate kingdom. That idea feels just as unsettling today as it probably did in 1997, and the game wastes almost no time showing you exactly where you stand inside of that world, because you're not a legendary hero, you're a mercenary, someone who's only here because you're getting paid to be. And the people you're working for, well, they're pretty much eco-terrorists. Instead of immediately presenting good versus evil, Final Fantasy VII asked you to take a step back and think about perspective. Avalanche believes that they're saving the planet. Shinra labels them as terrorists. From the outside looking in, both sides have arguments that they're trying to justify, and the best villains are always the ones that truly think that they're on the right side of history. It immediately creates these moral gray areas that are essential to the depth of the story. Of course, the deeper you get into Midgar, the more you begin understanding exactly why Avalanche even exists in the first place. Shinra's entire empire runs on Mako. At first, it just seems like another fictional energy source, but the more you learn, the more horrifying the truth becomes. Mako isn't simply fuel, it's the planet's life force, the spiritual energy that every living thing comes from before eventually returning after death. It's almost like the Force from Star Wars, but in a tangible form. Shinra isn't just mining electricity, they're literally draining the life out of the world itself. I love how elegantly Final Fantasy VII builds this into every single aspect of the game. Even the magic system reinforces the world building. Materia isn't just some random gameplay mechanic thrown in because every RPG needs to have spells. Materia is crystallized Mako. You're literally carrying condensed pieces of the planet's energy inside of your weapons and armor, using that same life force to cast magic and enhance your abilities. It's one of those ideas that feels so natural and just right that you almost forget how intelligently everything ties together and how much work must have went into the design. The mechanics aren't even separated from the story either, they're a part of it. And that level of cohesion is something that I've always appreciated in game design, and Final Fantasy VII absolutely nails it. But perhaps the biggest surprise during those opening hours wasn't the world, it was Cloud himself. Cloud might be one of the most misunderstood protagonists in all of gaming, with an absolutely phenomenal arc. If all you know about him comes from modern crossovers, memes, or his appearance in games like Smash Bros, it's easy to assume he's simply another stoic anime swordsman who spends the entire game brooding in silence and pulling bad bitches, and that's definitely the impression that I had for years. Well, playing the original game completely changed that perception. Cloud doesn't begin the story as a reluctant hero, or even really that much of a likable guy, to be honest. If anything, he comes across as arrogant, emotionally distant, and almost dismissive of everybody that's around him. He's here to do one thing, and that's to do a job, collect his paycheck, and move on. He constantly reminds Avalanche that he isn't fighting for their cause, and he keeps everyone at arm's length. It feels very intentional, like the game wants you to question whether this is really the person you want to root for. But of course, as the story progresses, that confident exterior slowly begins to crack and small inconsistencies start to appear. Strange headaches interrupt conversations, memories don't quite line up the way they should, and there are moments where even Cloud himself seems uncertain about what is actually going on. Rather than revealing everything at once, Final Fantasy VII slowly peels back the layers of his character over dozens of hours, letting the mystery build naturally. And by the time I realized where the story was heading, I understood why so many people consider him to be one of gaming's greatest protagonists. It's not because he's effortlessly cool, which I mean, he is, but also because beneath that carefully constructed persona is someone far more vulnerable than he wants anyone, including himself, to believe. That gradual approach to character development extends across the entire cast. One thing Final Fantasy VI taught me was just how important memorable party members are to an RPG, especially for somebody who hasn't been the hugest fan of them in the past. But once again, Square absolutely delivers here. The difference is that while Final Fantasy VI impressed me with the sheer size of its roster, Final Fantasy VII spends more time allowing each of its core characters to breathe. You aren't simply recruiting party members to fill combat roles. You're traveling alongside people who all carry their own fears, regrets, and motivations, and those personalities constantly shape the journey. Barrett, however, was probably the biggest surprise for me, because at first glance he seems to be exactly what you'd expect. Loud, aggressive, and completely committed to Avalanche's mission. But the longer you spend with him, the more complicated he becomes. Beneath all of that anger is just a father who's desperately trying to build a better future for his daughter, while constantly questioning whether the violence he's chosen is actually making the world any better. He isn't just fighting Shinra because they're evil, he's wrestling with whether his own actions are creating the future that he believes in. And that kind of moral uncertainty gives him far more depth than I was ready for, and I already knew that this series didn't mess around. Tifa impressed me for entirely different reasons, however. No, not because she's a baddie, which she is, but she's never the loudest person in the room, and she's arguably the emotional anchor and heart that keeps the entire group together. She understands Cloud better than almost anyone, yet even she struggles to reconcile the person standing in front of her with the memories that she carries. There's a beautifully feminine compassion to her character that never feels forced, and as the story unfolds, she becomes increasingly more important to Cloud's journey in ways that I never saw coming. It's a subtle performance, but one that quietly becomes essential to everything the game is trying to accomplish. With Aerith, before playing Final Fantasy VII, she was another character that I felt like I already knew simply because she's become so iconic over the years, but actually spending time with her is a completely different experience than simply recognizing her face. She brings optimism and warmth that immediately contrasts with Cloud's detached personality. She jokes and teases with him, slowly chipping away at the emotional walls he's built around himself. And some of my favorite moments in the early game aren't massive boss fights or dramatic cutscenes. They're simply banter between characters that make them feel like real people, rather than party members waiting for their next turn in combat. Even the supporting cast leaves a lasting impression. Red, Sid, Vincent, Yuffie, Kate Sith, and several others all bring completely different perspectives to the journey, making the world feel much larger than the handful of locations you're currently exploring, which already feel pretty large. Even the Turks, who could have easily been written as generic corporate henchmen, have enough personality that they often feel more like recurring rivals than faceless enemies. Final Fantasy VII constantly gives its characters room to simply exist together, arguing, joking, disagreeing, and reflecting on everything that's happening around them. Those quieter moments do just as much to build the world as the game's biggest story revelations. But of course, no discussion of Final Fantasy VII would be complete without Sephiroth. Like Cloud, he was already very familiar to me long before I ever played the game. But I never understood really why or who he truly was. Well, experiencing the original game answered that question pretty much immediately, because my boy is absolutely dripping with aura. One of the smartest decisions Square could have made was refusing to overuse him, because modern games often place their villains directly in front of your face every 5 seconds, constantly reminding you who the antagonist is, and you can indeed create the feeling of a constant looming threat without shoving it in your face every 2 seconds. I mean, look at Final Fantasy VI with Kefka, while Sephiroth feels almost mythical by comparison. For a surprisingly long time, you don't truly know him, you just hear about him. You arrive at locations only to find the aftermath of his actions. Entire groups of enemies have already been wiped out before you ever even get there. Characters react to his name with genuine fear long before you fully understand what makes him so terrifying in the first place. I'm telling you, the aura of this man is ridiculous. Every appearance leaves more questions than it leaves answers, and that mystery becomes one of the driving forces pushing the narrative forward. It also helps that Final Fantasy VII understands the power of, again, restraint. Because Sephiroth isn't intimidating simply because he's incredibly powerful and handsome. No, my dear Guardian. He's frightening because the game lets your imagination do much of the work. And your imagination will always make up a scarier concept than any piece of media, and I'll die on that hill. And that's one reason why I hate when horror movies show too much of whatever the evil thing is, because as soon as you see it, your brain is like, oh, well, what I was imagining was way scarier than that. But every new encounter adds another layer to the mystery surrounding him, making him feel less like a traditional villain and more like an unstoppable force that's slowly moving just beyond your reach. By the time he finally steps into the spotlight, he already feels larger than life. And just when I thought I had a good understanding of what Final Fantasy VII was trying to be, the game delivered one of the greatest moments I've ever experienced in any video game ever. After spending hours exploring Midgar, I really believed that this enormous city was going to be the primary setting for the entire adventure, because it already felt massive, fleshed out with a social hierarchy and enough world building to carry an entire game. And then I escaped the city, and I realized I hadn't even reached the real beginning of the adventure. This is what video games are supposed to be. Walking out into the overworld completely reshaped my understanding of the game's scale. As soon as I thought I was finally getting a grip on the game said, "Sit your ass down, boy, you don't even know anything yet." Suddenly there were mountains stretching into the distance, forests, isolated towns, deserts, amusement parks, forgotten civilizations, ancient temples, frozen landscapes, and an entire planet waiting to be explored by your boy Milky. Midgar, which just a few minutes ago had seemed huge, was just one city in a much larger world. Few games have ever expanded their scope so dramatically without making it feel forced, like here's the moment, get ready, are you ready? Instead, it creates one of the most unforgettable gaming moments where you suddenly realize the journey ahead is going to be far bigger than you ever imagined. Even more staggering is how different the world feels from Midgar. Outside of the city's steel walls, Shinra's influence is still everywhere, but it no longer feels all-consuming. Small towns cling to ordinary life while the corporation continues searching for new resources to exploit. Nature begins reclaiming the landscape, and despite the monsters roaming the wilderness, there's an overwhelming sense of freedom that perfectly contrasts with Midgar's oppressive atmosphere. The world feels lonely, but in the best possible way, making the adventure feel genuinely epic rather than simply large for the sake of being large, which is a huge fucking problem with today's game worlds. But man, the story. The best thing about Final Fantasy VII's story wasn't simply that it was emotional, because plenty of games try to tell emotional stories and do it pretty well. What impressed me was how naturally it continued expanding without ever feeling like it had lost sight of what made the opening so compelling. It begins as a relatively grounded conflict against a corrupt corporation exploiting the planet's resources, but over time it evolves into something much larger. Themes of identity, grief, environmental destruction, destiny, and humanity's relationship with the world gradually begin to weave themselves into the narrative without ever feeling preachy or overly complicated. Again, another huge fucking problem with today's games. Every few hours, it seems like another revelation completely changes your understanding of what you've already experienced. And just when you think you've figured out where the story is heading, it peels back yet another layer beneath it. One thing I really appreciated is that Final Fantasy VII never feels like it's wasting your time, something I've said lots of times in this series. And that's something I've struggled with RPGs before, because it's easy for games this large to lose momentum somewhere in the middle, sending you on long stretches of disconjointed errands before finally remembering the main plot. And I never felt that here. Even the quieter moments seem to be building towards something larger. Sure, there might be a little bit of fat to trim here and there, but for the most part, every new town teaches you something about the world. Every major location introduces another piece of history, another perspective on Shinra's influence, or another clue about the mysteries surrounding Cloud and Sephiroth. The slower moments don't exist to simply pad out the runtime. They exist to make the bigger emotional payoffs land even harder when they finally arrive. And that pacing also gives the world an incredible sense of history. One of my favorite things about Final Fantasy VI was how it made its world feel like it had existed long before I, as the player, had arrived. Final Fantasy VII somehow manages to accomplish that feeling in an entirely different way. Ancient civilizations, forgotten temples, abandoned research facilities, quiet mountain villages, remote observatories, every location feels like it has its own place within the world's history instead of existing purely to serve the player. It never feels like you're walking through a series of levels. It feels like you're traveling across an actual planet that's been shaped by thousands of years of conflict, discovery, and human ambition. Though outside of the story, I was again shocked by just how much I enjoyed the gameplay. As I've mentioned countless times throughout this series, I'm not someone who naturally gravitates towards traditional turn-based combat. At least I wasn't. Well, Final Fantasy VI completely changed my perspective on what the genre could offer, so going into 7, I was genuinely excited rather than skeptical. Thankfully, it did not disappoint at all. The active time battle system strikes a balance that feels deliberate without becoming sluggish. Encounters move quickly enough that random battles rarely overstay their welcome, but they're still strategic enough that every decision matters. I never felt like I was simply mashing the attack command and waiting for the fight to end. Am I crazy, or does winning tougher turn-based battles make you feel smart? Is that a thing? I don't know, I'm an idiot, but every encounter forced me to pay attention, adapt, and think about how I wanted to approach the situation. And the biggest reason for that is materia. Even after experiencing Final Fantasy VI's fantastic Esper system, materia immediately stood out as one of the smartest progression systems I've ever seen in a game. Instead of locking characters into rigid classes or permanently assigning specific magical abilities, nearly everything revolves around these small crystalline orbs that can be freely equipped, removed, and combined however you so choose. Want Cloud acting as your primary healer? Go for it. Want Barret casting powerful offensive spells while Tifa handles support? You can do that too. The game constantly encourages experimentation instead of punishing it or forcing it, allowing you to customize your party however you see fit. And what makes the system even more brilliant is how seamlessly it ties into the story itself. As mentioned earlier, materia isn't just an excuse to let players cast spells. It's crystallized Mako, the condensed energy of the planet itself. In other words, every magical ability that you use is directly connected to the same resource Shinra has been exploiting since the opening hours of the game. According to the lore, materia allows its user to draw upon the knowledge and power contained within the life stream itself, making the gameplay mechanics feel like a natural extension of the world's mythology, rather than something that exists separately from it. Golly, this is some good stuff, boys. Oh my god. It's an elegant piece of design that reinforces the game's central themes every time you open the equipment menu, which is something I've never seen before. Huh? I also found myself enjoying the progression even more so than I expected. Materia grows stronger alongside you, unlocking more powerful spells and abilities over time, which means every battle feels rewarding in more ways than simply gaining experience points. You're constantly refining your toolkit, experimenting with different combinations, linking support materia to offensive spells, and discovering strategies that completely change how your party functions. It scratches that same itch as Final Fantasy VI's customization systems, while carving out an identity that's entirely its own. Looking back now, it's easy to see why so many fans still consider it one of the greatest RPG mechanics ever created. The visuals are probably the game's most divisive aspect today, and I do understand why, because early 3D graphics have aged in ways that sprite-based games often haven't, and after spending dozens of hours with Final Fantasy VI's incredibly expressive pixel art, the blocky character models initially felt like a step backwards. There's no denying that some of them do look downright goofy by modern standards, but after only a few hours, I honestly started to like it. Now, this could literally just be nostalgia for this era of games, but the real reason is because the game's true visual strength isn't found in its character models, it's found in its atmosphere. The pre-rendered backgrounds are still absolutely gorgeous. Every screen feels carefully composed, almost like you're walking through hand-painted concept art. Midgar's endless steel corridors, eerie laboratories, forgotten temples, dense forests, and sweeping landscapes all possess a distinct identity that make every new location memorable. Stop hating on the graphics, okay? It doesn't deserve it, and go play the remake. I don't know what to tell you. Even with the technological limitations of 1997, Final Fantasy VII constantly manages to create environments that feel believable. It's also pretty fascinating to view the game through a historical lens. Because rather than simply making a prettier RPG, because that would be easy, Square was exploring entirely new ways of presenting their stories. Cinematic camera angles, dramatic transitions, sweeping full-motion cutscenes, and carefully framed environments all contribute to an experience that must have felt unlike anything players had seen before. It wasn't technology for the sake of showing off technology. It was technology only there to serve the game, and that's it. Nearly every cinematic moment exists because it strengthens the storytelling. I repeat, only because it strengthens the storytelling, making the adventure feel far more immersive than what had been possible only a few years earlier. And then of course, there's the soundtrack. I really don't know what else to say about Nobuo Uematsu at this point, other than the man simply refuses to miss, because following up Final Fantasy VI's legendary soundtrack would have been an impossible task for most composers, but somehow the man, the myth, the legend delivers another masterpiece that feels completely different while somehow being every bit as memorable. I guess lightning does strike in the same place twice. The music isn't just background ambience, it becomes inseparable from the locations themselves. For example, the industrial pulse of Midgar, or the haunting sense of loneliness while exploring the overworld, or the intensity of the boss battles, and the quieter emotional pieces all become permanently tied to the memories you're creating as you play. I can think back to specific moments in the adventure and immediately hear the music that accompanied them. Very few composers have that ability. Uematsu doesn't simply write songs, he writes memories, with each note representing a different thought or emotion. Even people such as myself who haven't played these games often recognize melodies like Aerith's theme or One Winged Angel because they've transcended the games themselves and become part of gaming history. This wasn't simply another sequel trying to build on what came before. It was a game that fundamentally changed the way people looked at role-playing games. I'm sure that for lots of you, this was your first exposure to Japanese RPGs. It showcased what the jump from cartridges to CDs made possible, proving that games could be cinematic without sacrificing player agency. And more importantly, it introduced millions of Western players to a genre that they may have otherwise ignored completely. Playing it nearly 30 years later, I was honestly surprised by just how much of that legacy still holds up. So often, legendary games become trapped beneath the weight of their own reputation. You hear people call something one of the greatest games ever made for decades, and by the time you finally experience it for yourself, expectations have grown so impossibly high that almost no game could realistically live up to them. Final Fantasy VII, however, somehow manages to avoid that problem. Yeah, sure, certain mechanics do show their age once in a while, and yes, the polygonal character models can occasionally look a little awkward. I actually liked them, but those things never overshadow what truly matters: Great storytelling, memorable characters, incredible world building, and rewarding progression systems and phenomenal music don't simply disappear because technology moves forward. If anything, I think playing Final Fantasy VII immediately after playing Final Fantasy VI made me appreciate both of these games even more. Going into 6, I expected to respect it more than I actually enjoyed it. Instead, it completely changed how I looked at turn-based RPGs. It made me realize that I'd spent years dismissing an entire genre without even giving its best games a fair chance. Idiot milky take as usual. And by the time I reached the credits, I understood why people spoke so passionately about Final Fantasy. That experience completely changed my expectations heading into 7. Instead of wondering whether I'd enjoy another turn-based RPG, I found myself genuinely excited to see how Square could possibly follow up what I'd just played. And the fascinating thing is that they didn't try to compete with Final Fantasy VI by simply making a larger version of the same game. They changed directions completely. Where Final Fantasy VI feels like the ultimate expression of everything the 16-bit era had been building toward, Final Fantasy VII feels like the beginning of something completely new. One celebrates the absolute peak of sprite-based storytelling, while the other embraces cinematic presentation, three-dimensional environments, and just as much of an intimate character-driven narrative. They're both trying to accomplish different things. And because of that, I don't really think they're competing with one another at all. Before starting this journey, I constantly saw people debating which game was better, Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VII. It's one of those arguments that's existed for decades, and I'm sure it'll exist for decades to come. And after finally playing both, I honestly don't think there's a wrong answer here. Final Fantasy VI feels like the masterpiece that closed one chapter of RPG history, and Final Fantasy VII feels like the masterpiece that opened the next. One perfected an established formula, and the other reinvented it. That's a pretty incredible achievement. It's also impossible for me to ignore just how much of Final Fantasy VI and VII's DNA still exists throughout the industry today. Modern RPGs constantly borrow ideas that either originated here or were popularized because of these games. Even beyond RPGs, you can still see Final Fantasy VI and VII's influence almost everywhere. They weren't just great games, they became part of gaming culture itself. Cloud's Buster Swords, Sephiroth's Masamune, Aerith's Pink Ribbon, One-Winged Angel, the image of Midgar's towering reactors, these aren't just memorable moments for Final Fantasy fans anymore. They become some of the most recognizable symbols in gaming as a whole. Final Fantasy VI completely shattered my misconception about the genre, and Final Fantasy VII, well, it reinforced that realization by showing me just how many different directions a great RPG can take without losing what makes the genre special in the first place. It didn't just meet my impossible expectations left behind by Final Fantasy VI, it justified them. And for that reason, Final Fantasy VII is an absolutely legendary game and an absolute banger that has truly made me ask the question, have we regressed in the world of video games? And with that, we come to the end of our time travel journey. As always, I had an absolute blast playing Final Fantasy VII, like for real, it's phenomenal. But do you prefer old games or new games? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to see more of this, feel free to drop what you'd like to see next in the comments. Yes, even if you've already commented your request 10 times, don't be afraid to comment them again, because it's possible that it gets lost in the comments, and I do want to see all of the recommendations that I can. As always, don't forget to like, hype, comment, and subscribe to become a guardian of the glaze, and I'll see you next time on the Milky Donut.